Hi, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show you how to draw this elderly portrait full of wrinkles using graphite pencils. So grab your tools and let's get started. So these are the art supplies I'm going to use for this drawing, and you can pause the video right here to note them down. I draw the outlines using grid method, and you can find all the references including this outline grid reference on my Patreon profile. Link is in the description. I'm using this A3 size paper from my ordinary drawing paper pad, and the drawing portion area is 11 x 14 inches. I'm going to mask the edges of this paper using this masking tape. It will help you get a straight and sharp border in the end. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to add the background using an 8B graphite powder with a medium-sized dry brush like this. Make sure to add this layer in a circular scribbling motion to get a smooth and even finish. Now I'm going to darken the outline of these folds and wrinkles around the eye using an 8B pencil so they don't fade away in the blending process. And when you are done with darkening these lines, add a base layer of 2B graphite powder over it using a medium-sized dry brush. Then grab an 8B pencil and add a second layer of shadows on the wrinkles and folds to create depth, and extend them a little bit outwards as well. If you don't have a graphite powder kit, you can make one at home by watching this video from the cards. Blend this layer using a small dry brush with great precision to get a smooth base for future layers. The wrinkles or folds of the elderly skin is not just one simple line with shading. Instead, you have to add small lines and shade around it to make the wrinkle look hyper-realistic and 3D. Moving on to the hair, and I'm using my sharp tip perfection eraser to add this first layer of random individual hair in this left portion. As we know that the texture of a perfection eraser is kind of chalky. So when we erase over the lighter portions with dirty tip, it makes it dull and black instead of highlighting and erasing it. So always clean the tip of your perfection eraser using a sandpaper or any rough surface during the highlighting process. And by the way, the real-time version of this tutorial is available on my Patreon profile. So if you want to see all these details up close and in real time, you can visit my Patreon profile. Link is in the description. Okay, now to add the second layer and to make the previous ones pop up a little more, I'm using my Mono Zero eraser with a sharp tip and adding these fine lines over the previous ones. Make sure to keep your Mono Zero eraser clean and sharp at all times during this erasing process. You can rub it on a rough and textured surface like this to clean the tip and get sharp corners for thin lines and highlights. Now start adding these small and slightly tilted lines and texture using a perfection eraser with a sharp tip in the forehead portion, especially in between the darker lines to give them a more 3D look. I'm going to further brighten up these highlights using my chisel tip Mono Zero eraser to make them look more shiny. You don't have to copy the exact details from the reference image. Just make sure you don't rush this process and add these details slowly and carefully. Keep the texture random and try to avoid parallel lines and patterns. And by the way, you can get access to our premium content and support this channel through Patreon. You can sign up through different membership levels and get access to all the outline and grid references, etc. We have an ever-growing library of hundreds of exclusive and real-time tutorials, and you will also get access to 4 new tutorials every month. You can also post your artworks in our active community of patrons and participate in our weekly critique sessions where I give my honest and positive critiques on your artworks, so you can improve your skills and get better with your drawing. Visit the link in description and become a premium member today. Now for the extra bright texture and highlights, I'm going to use my sharp tip electric eraser and adding the small dotted and line texture, especially in between and over the folds to make them look more 3D and round. Moving on to the eyebrows, and first of all make these type of small and soft dots for the starting point of the hair, and then extend it like a small stroke on this left side and in the direction of the eyebrows, just like this. To maximize the level of detail in your work, I would suggest you to concentrate on a small section at a time. In this way, you can focus your efforts on a specific area and recreate it with greater precision. As you can see from the reference image that this specific portion is in focus and has sharp details. So make sure you keep the tip of your pencil sharp so you don't add thick and blurry lines, as it will take the essence of sharpness away from the drawing. Now moving on to the eye and eye bag portion, and first of all I'm darkening the outline and wrinkles first using my 8B pencil. I used the same 8B pencil to lightly shade this area with the base layer. You can also use your 2B pencil for this purpose, as it will work and look even better. And then blending it with a medium-sized dry brush afterwards to get a smooth base for the future layers of shades and texture. I've used the same 8B pencil to extend these lines further and to add shadows in the darker areas of the eye bag. If you are using a smooth paper, then after blending this layer it will fade away a little bit. So I would suggest you to add another layer using a 5B pencil to further darken these details. Now grab a perfection eraser with a sharp tip and define the upper eyelid by adding a curved line of highlight along this outline of the eyelid. And for the highlights and details in the iris, I'm going to use my mono zero eraser to add lighter highlights as a draft first, and then I brightened them afterwards using the same mono zero eraser but with a chisel tip. You can use your perfection eraser to add these soft and blended highlights in the sclera as well. Now moving on to the eye bag, and first of all I will add the mixture of these slightly curved and straight lines or texture using mono zero eraser. You can keep the reference image in mind, but you don't have to copy the exact same details and highlights, etc. You can add them as you like, but keep this left area more highlighted than the right one to match it with the overall look of the eye bag from the reference image. And then I'm going to use my electric razor with a sharp tip to further fine tune this area. You need to add extra bright highlights to achieve realistic skin texture and to make it look more shiny. You can go back and forth with your tools to improve and perfect this skin texture as much as you want. There is always a room for improvement and there are no limitations in hyperrealism. Okay, now moving on to the right side, and I will repeat a similar process of darkening the outline of the folds and wrinkles first and then shading and blending it using a dry brush. I'm further darkening and adding depth in the folds using my 8B pencil to give them a 3D look. You can also use your 5B or 9B pencil for this purpose, whichever you are comfortable with. Back in the days, I struggled a lot with this kind of hyper-realistic skin texture, and there was not a single tutorial available at that time. And I did a lot of experiments and learned it myself by practicing it again and again. So I decided then and there to show each and every step with detail in my each and every tutorial to help people like you who want to learn and achieve hyper-realism. As the paper I'm using is quite smooth, and I've added this final layer using an 8B pencil. So if I blend it with brush, it will fade away and make the wrinkles look dull. So I'm using my 2H pencil over it to blend the previous layers, and it will help in keeping the shade darker and embed the graphite in the paper instead of removing it from the surface. For the highlights, I'm using a perfection eraser and then adding small dots and slightly curved lines in between the darker lines of the folds. Okay, so I'm using the same perfection eraser to lighten some of these darker shadows and to add softer highlights. Now to add some bright highlights in between and over the folds and wrinkles, I'm using my sharp tip mono zero eraser and adding these small slant lines and dots where required. Notice that the direction of these lines are changing depending on the area you are working on. So again, you don't have to copy the exact shape and details, but keep the overall look of these areas from the reference image in mind while adding these lines. I'm using my perfection eraser to soften the edges of these bright highlights where required, and then using my 2H graphite pencil to add depth and to further fine-tune the overall shape of the highlighted areas. I'm also blending the barriers between the darker and highlighted portions using the same 2H pencil. I'm going to repeat the similar process of adding softer highlights in the form of small lines and dots first using my sharp tip mono zero eraser. And by the way, if you want to learn the basics of drawing first, you can join my course on Udemy. I put my course on sale for 5 days of every month. You can check the link in description to see if the sale is going on right now and get enrolled as soon as possible. Okay, now for the brighter highlights, I'm using my sharp tip electric eraser and adding these extra sharp and white dots or highlights, especially in between and over the previous ones to give the whole skin texture a more 3D and realistic look. So while I was adding these highlights, something silly happened. I forgot to check the brightness of my iPad and went on to add these highlights using Mono Zero Eraser, which resulted in softer and dull highlights instead of sharp and brighter ones, because I was trying to match the tones of this area with the reference image. So whenever you are using a reference image which is quite dark and has a lot of contrast like this, make sure to keep the brightness of your phone or tablet at a specific level throughout the whole drawing process, so you don't have to readjust the overall tones as I did here. Now moving on to the eyebrow area, and first of all I'm softening some of these darker shadows using my Perfection Eraser. Then I'm adding the second layer of highlights using my Mono Zero Eraser with a sharp tip to finalize the overall skin texture in this eyebrow portion. Now for the eyebrow hair, I'm using my sharp tip 5B pencil and adding these small and slightly curved strokes. Notice that the hair are denser and closer together in the starting portion of the eyebrows as compared to the end. So keep that in mind while adding these individual eyebrow hair. Now adding the highlights using my sharp tip Mono Zero Eraser in between the hair strokes we just added to increase the contrast of these areas and make it look more sharp. For the brighter highlights, you can use your electric eraser if needed. Now moving on to the eye, and I'm going to repeat a similar process of darkening the outline first and then adding a base layer. The only difference here is that I was experimenting in this area and I didn't blend the base layer with a brush. Instead, I directly used the 2H pencil over it to see how it will blend and work over this layer, which made the overall layer look very rough and textured. So to avoid this, you should stick with the typical method of adding base layer first with whichever pencil you prefer and then blending it with a dry brush to achieve smooth base layer for future layers. I'm going to use my Mono Zero Eraser to add these softer highlights in the eye and skin texture. And for the brighter highlights, I'm going to use my electric eraser. For the left cheek portion, firstly I'm darkening the lines of the folds and wrinkles using my 8B pencil, so that these lines don't disappear in the shading and blending process later on. Then adding the base layer using a B pencil and blending it with a medium-sized dry brush like this. Now I'm using my 5B pencil, and firstly I will add these small and soft dots, and then I will extend them a little bit up and downwards to create a base for pores and skin texture. They will also help to build up the overall contrast in the cheek portion. I'm going to add these dotted highlights in between and over the darker texture we just added, especially near the nose using my Mono Zero Eraser. Now in order to lighten some of the darker shadows and to add highlights, I tried using my Perfection Eraser, but it actually affected the area of the highlights and made it permanently dull. So if you need extra bright highlights anywhere in your drawing, I would suggest you to avoid using a Perfection Eraser, as it embeds the graphite into the paper texture and it becomes really difficult to remove it later on using any type of eraser. The only solution in that case is to use jelly roll pen, which again we mostly try to avoid in hyper-realistic drawings because it fades away in the preservation process. You can use your Perfection Eraser on areas where there are soft highlights, as it works amazingly on those areas. Okay, now to add brighter highlights, I'm going to use my electric eraser and further fine tune the previous highlights to make them look more sharp and shiny. I'm adding these small strokes to mimic the wrinkles and lines to give the skin texture a more realistic look. And with this step, we are done with this first part of this drawing. I will resume this drawing process from the nose in the next part, which is coming out next Saturday. So stay tuned. It takes so much time and efforts to create this tutorial, so please leave a like if you enjoyed this one. It helps me a lot as an artist. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.